Assalamu alaikum guys, this is Sean with the Muslim Vibe over here at ISNACon, and ISNA is the Islamic Society of North America. They hold this convention every year, and we are glad to have our guest, Dr. Abdul El-Sayed. How are you doing today?
I'm, alhamdulillah, doing very well. Excited to be here.
Great, excited to have you. So a little bit about our guest. Dr. Abdul El-Sayed is a physician, epidemiologist, public health expert, and a progressive activist. Native to Detroit, Michigan, he obtained his PhD in public health from Oxford University and his MD from Columbia. And he is the chair at Southpaw, Michigan, and a senior fellow at the Governing Institute. A lot of accolades.
Alhamdulillah, it's all from elsewhere.
Awesome. So you've achieved a lot. What has motivated you to get through all of that?
Yeah, alhamdulillah, you know, I was lucky and privileged enough to be born in a community that sustained me, that made sure I had the education I needed, that took care of my body and helped me grow. My father immigrated from Egypt back in the 1970s, and I also had the experience of spending a lot of my summers back there. Cool. And there, much of my family, particularly on his side, comes from a very different background of life. My grandmother never got to go to school. She was illiterate.
Wow.
And transporting from my comfortable suburban home to working class Alexandria neighborhoods every summer really showed me exactly how privileged I was, and the responsibility that came with that privilege. And so to me, the crazy thing was that we lived about 40 minutes from Detroit.
Okay.
And when I would travel to Egypt, right, I'd take about 12 hours to get there, and I would travel about 10 years difference in life expectancy.
Wow.
But if I were to travel the 45 minutes south to Detroit from where I grew up, I'd travel that same 10 years difference.
Wow.
And that to me is astounding, that in the richest, most powerful country in the world, we have those kinds of disparities. And so I wanted to be a doctor to do something about that, and came to appreciate that there's very little one doctor in a system can do. And that's when I broadened my horizons and focused a lot more on public health.
Great.
And did my PhD there, and then got the opportunity to serve that city of Detroit as health commissioner for a couple years and rebuild the department after it had been shut down. And in that role, came to appreciate just how much what we can do is driven by the political decisions of leaders who we elect. And this was during the time of the Flint water crisis, which is a city just 50 miles north of Detroit. And also, you know, right during when Donald Trump was both campaigning and ultimately got elected. And at that point, I said, you know what? Maybe I should take a different tack, and I decided to run for office in Michigan. So.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So you mentioned that Flint water crisis, right? Something big, and it's something still going on.
That's right.
Going through that process of being in the public health department and all that, there was probably a lot of like bureaucracy and red tape. Through that process, how do you stay grounded? I'm sure it's pretty frustrating to go through.
Well, I think it's really important for folks to keep their eyes on a mission and to ask themselves every day what they can do to advance that mission. There's something about getting ground down and getting frustrated I just don't think we have the privilege to do. You know, I told you about my grandmother, and I told you about my family, and I told you about the contrast between my experience and theirs. And how dare I get frustrated at the door and just be like, well, you know what, I'm just taking my ball and going home. We don't have that right so long as there are people suffering the consequences of that red tape and those bureaucratic systems that grind them down. And I think when you center the people you're leading for rather than the people you're leading against, it becomes a lot easier to lead. And to lead with a smile on your face and to do what you need to do every day. And some days you're going to fall backwards, but you know, that only shows you how much further you have to go and also how far you've come. So one day at a time, every day, just deciding that you're going to do what you can today to move that ball forward.
That is the attitude. That's amazing. So Flint, why is it still going on? Why is there still unclean water all these years later?
You know, it's easy to look at a circumstance like the Flint water crisis and point just to when policymakers decided to change the water source, which corroded the pipes, which leached lead into the water in Flint. But the story of Flint goes back far further than that decision in 2014. It goes back to decisions made decades earlier about who got to live where, right? When poor, largely black folks moved in to Flint, They were not given the same jobs as everybody else during the Great Migration. They were forced into the peripheries, most marginalized parts of town. And then GM, which really built out Flint's economy, when they decided to leave, the folks who left with them tended to be white, upper middle income, which left those low income African American folks who were stuck in the most marginalized parts of town, then responsible for sustaining the full infrastructure, the bureaucracy that was Flint city government. And when they inevitably couldn't do it, right, the state took over their finances and said, well, you're profligate, right? You're not managing your finances correctly. We're going to take control. That's when they made the decision to shut down or to change the water source, which ultimately led to the problem. And the same challenge has been that government does not want to acknowledge its responsibility and does not want to focus on how they can get those leaded pipes out of the ground, which is the real issue here.
So speaking of government taking responsibility for these things, we have kind of zooming out a little bit. You have the government very vocal about a lot of things, pretty silent on the Amazon fires and everything that we've got going on right now. Progressive politics is on the rise, trying to tackle that issue with things like the Green New Deal. And one thing that people bring up about progressive politics when it comes to taxation and the Green New Deal is how do you fund all of that stuff? I know on your platform you've also mentioned things like publicly owned broadband as a utility. And so these kind of things, how do you respond to how are we going to pay for this?
So a couple of ways. Number one, the systems that we advocate themselves are usually a lot more efficient. So let me just explain quickly Medicare for All as an example.
Sure.
Right now, our healthcare is provided by a system of for-profit corporate insurance companies. Each one of those for-profit corporate insurance companies has a C-suite. Their CEO makes tens of millions of dollars a year. Tens of millions of dollars a year. They have a marketing budget, advertising budget, and their overhead is 15% of all the money that we pay into healthcare.
Okay.
Right?
Wow.
On top of that, because there are so many of them, on the doctor side, everybody has to know how to bill every different insurance company. All of them have their own protocol. Okay. Another high set of overhead.
Right.
But if you look at Medicare as a system, right, the system that currently exists to take care of people over the age of 65 and those with disabilities, its overhead is 3%.
Wow.
So you're talking about 12% savings just in changing. And everybody's like, well, how are you going to pay for it? I'm like, well, look, I'd much rather pay for actual health care than pay some CEO to make tens of millions of dollars a year to keep me from the health care that I already paid for.
Totally.
Right?
Totally.
So that's part one. Part two is this. In our system right now, the rich corporations just don't pay for their fair share. I mean, look, Amazon.
Yeah. Perfect example.
If I made as much as Amazon, I'd pay $4 billion in taxes. You know how much Amazon got away paying in income tax? Zero. So it's not impossible to ask the richest, most powerful institutions in the country to pay their fair share. I think that just makes sense.
Yeah.
And so both the systems themselves are more efficient. Like we are creating a system that biases the profits of big corporations. And if we just ask the rich and the powerful to pay their fair share, we'd have substantially more money. And then the last point is saying, look, our government right now has spent trillions of dollars on making war. And my point is, I would much rather invest in the healthcare of a kid who doesn't have it right now than invest in an F-35 program to make an airplane that doesn't even fly.
Yeah.
Right? Because some company lobbied government to tell them that this is what we needed next. It's about efficiency in the system, it's about the right priorities, and it's about asking the rich to pay their fair share. It just makes sense.
So we have the money. It's just about directing it in a responsible way.
We have the money. The problem is that the people who have the most of it want to pay the least of it.
Right.
And we're not directing it, like you said, in a responsible way.
Yeah. Wow. So, interesting about your platform, one thing that really stood out to me is broadband as a public utility. I really think that the information divide in this country is one of the things that is galvanizing a lot of people, very far on the right and very far on the left. So how could something like this kind of bridge that gap with all this fake news, and you have people on the right in their echo chambers, people on the left in their echo chambers?
Well, the highway system as we know it today was built right after World War II by Dwight Eisenhower's administration. And their argument was, in modern America, highways ought to be something that everybody has access to.
Yeah.
And my argument is that in modern America, 21st century America, internet ought to be something that everybody has access to,
Totally.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're coming to you on the internet.
Yeah.
All of this is internet enabled.
Yep.
I mean, today you literally can check the weather, schedule your day, make a phone call, and then order your coffee in the morning, all on the internet.
Yeah.
So the idea that there are people who don't have any of it right now, to me is astounding. And part of the problem is that we have ceded the right to create internet infrastructure to huge corporations who in rural communities don't have the incentive to do it because they're like, we're going to lay all this infrastructure and there are so few people here that it's not going to bring us back the benefits. So what we're saying is we ought to be able to create a public option for the internet, right? Look, if those corporations don't want to solve the problem and get these folks onto the information superhighway, the government ought to be a part of doing that.
So we're seeing a running theme here, privatized control versus government control, and obviously with capitalism, the whole purpose is to acquire capital.
That's right.
And so whatever it takes to do that.
And sometimes, right, if you just wed the interests of an institution to their bottom lines, they're not going to solve big picture problems. Mm-hmm. They're going to solve for their bottom line.
Yeah.
And that tends to hurt people.
Yeah.
If you go back to the advent of the progressive movement back in the early 1900s, the whole question was how do you stand up to the domination of robber barons and the kinds of trusts that they created.
Yeah.
And government over the next 50 years was able to stand up, bust a lot of those trusts in the ways that they were monopolizing important sectors of the economy, and at the same time provide really important regulations and public goods for people that ushered in the era of the middle class that we saw in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And what has happened now is that those corporations have pushed and lobbied for deregulation. They've grown their power, grown their expanse, and it's time for us to come back again and say, look, this isn't working for everyday folks. And part of the problem is, when we talk to folks, I spent 18 months talking to folks all over the state of Michigan. When you talk to folks, they are so frustrated by the circumstances of their lives, and they want answers. And ride people like Donald Trump down golden escalators, telling them that they're going to fix this thing, right? And if only all the white folk got together and stuck together, right, pushing this sort of white supremacy.
Right.
And what we know is that the problem isn't the immigrants, the problem isn't black folks in urban communities, the problem isn't people like you and me. The problem is that we've got these overgrown corporations that have put a stranglehold on life. They've sought to automate people out of their own work, and people are struggling to make a living in modern day America. We can solve it if we're willing to have the kind of courage and political foresight to step up and do something about it.
Automation, you bring that up. It's put a dent in a lot of people's lives. How do we kind of compensate for that? A lot of jobs are going to be lost, but I'm sure there's going to be a lot of ways that that's going to be able to employ people too, maybe.
Well, here's the problem. There are two things. Number one, we shouldn't be accelerating it, and sometimes the way that our tax schemes work is that we accelerate corporations investing in capital, which are literally robots that do people's jobs.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't be accelerating it. I mean, look, automation and technology are here to stay. They're going to keep going. On the other side of it, we need to make sure that we're educating folks so that they're ready for the jobs of tomorrow. But here's the problem. We have underfunded public education in our country for decades.
Yeah.
And we have sought to make good on the human capital gap by just importing really smart people, right? And that's what a lot of our immigration is, right? It's just like, well, look, we're not educating our people well, so we're just going to import all the smartest people from the rest of the world and bring them here, and then we'll be okay. And what's happened is that we've left a glut of folks who don't have the skills for tomorrow's jobs. And then lastly, we're really going to have to think about what happens when automation really devours huge middle-class sectors. So in the way that it's happened over the past 30, 40 years, it's usually devoured working and lower middle income jobs. What it's coming for is upper middle income jobs. So a radiologist, right, the doctor who reads an x-ray, the idea that a computer can't do a better job having read every x-ray that's ever been done in the history of medicine is absurd. Those jobs are going away. And so what happens then? And that's why we've got to really start thinking about whether it's a federal jobs guarantee or a universal basic income, which is like Social Security for all, or as Andrew Yang talks about it, a freedom dividend. Those are issues that we've got to really start debating, because at this point, a lot of what we're seeing right now is the frustration of saying, the job that I used to do is gone. And what do I do now?
Yeah, awesome. So with all of this kind of joblessness and the economy going down, one of the things that you see on the rise today is mental health issues. A lot of mental health issues. With that comes opioid crisis. How can we deal with that? And in America, a lot of the things that we see also can be attributed maybe to a spiritual deficiency. So how can we take an integrated approach to tackling that in America?
A couple of things. Just the infrastructure that we needed to tackle mental illness was decimated in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And here's why it happened. Back in the day, when people had mental illness, we very wrongfully used to put them in psychiatric hospitals and like shut the door. And that was wrong and terrible. And so the idea was, well, we have new medications and new ways of treating, so why don't we shut those big hospitals down and build up outpatient mental health facilities that could take care of them? But what happened was, when we shut down those psychiatric hospitals, we never built the mental health centers. And you know where a lot of those folks went? Jail.
On the streets, or jail.
Right. So in the 1800s, for example, 0.5% of people in jails had a diagnosable mental illness. Today, 1 in 5 does.
Wow.
And that's a big difference. And so a lot of our inability to care for people has put them out on the streets, which then ultimately puts them in jail. So we've got to solve that. We've got to be building out our outpatient mental health facilities. But there's another side of it that you talked about. A lot of the system of American life hasn't necessarily empowered people personally, psychologically, and spiritually. And so many more of us are living alone. We're lonelier than we've ever been. And the interesting thing about it is that you've got a phone in your hand, right? I presume right now you've got your interview material, we're having a great conversation. But I presume when you've got that phone in your hand, it's usually not because you're talking to somebody. It's usually because you're just looking right at it.
That's true. Very true.
And there's some really interesting research that shows that people who go on social media more are more likely to feel socially isolated. We turn to these things, and they keep us from actually being engaged in the world around us. And we're not building the kinds of spaces that bring people together. So there's some really interesting thought about what it means to build public places and spaces that bring people together, and really start emphasizing a life that people have real, healthy social relationships. Because the reality of it is that we talk about taking care of yourself. We don't really take care of ourselves as humans. We take care of each other. And we've stopped doing that for a really long time.
That's really profound. Yeah, I really feel that. You go around and people are on their phones, and a lot of times you would expect in this situation that people would be talking to each other and stuff, even with your own friends. So definitely something that needs to be tackled. So zooming out from that, the state of public health in America overall, that's one crisis that we have. But how can we you mentioned Medicare for all, but what else? What's the outlook on the state of public health in America?
It's not good. I mean, the current administration has been slashing funds both for health research and public health. We've got to keep investing. I mean, the thing about public health is it's not flashy. It doesn't really operate. You don't really see it out there. It just happens in the background. And when you hear about public health, it's usually because it's failing. And right now, we've got a lot of failure on the horizon, whether it's the rise of measles because of anti-vaxxers, or the skyrocketing cost of prescription drugs, which are keeping people away from the medications that they need to live their lives, or it's the fact that people can't get health care, or it's the fact that they're rolling back basic regulations on air quality and water quality that leave people in places like Flint, or people in communities like these breathing dirty air. And so we need to speak up for it. So I actually got a podcast coming out on this issue. In the end of September.
Where can people find that?
Yeah, it'll be on all of the podcast applications. So check it out. It's hosted by Crooked Media, who does Pod Save America. And right now, the current name that we're playing with is America Dissected, but we'll be announcing it in the next 3 weeks. And,
very cool.
And inshallah, it'll be debuting in a month. So it'll be a 10-part series that really breaks down all of these issues we just talked about, why bad things are happening, and what we can do about it.
Great. Inshallah, we'll put a link up to that.
Appreciate that.
I wanted to ask you about your forthcoming book. You have a book coming out, Moral Medicine, which is about diagnosing our country's epidemic of insecurity and empathy politics, that we all need to treat that.
That's right.
So you kind of touched on that before, but expand on your book.
Yeah, so we actually changed the title. It's called Healing Politics now. And it's the same idea. You know, I'm an epidemiologist, and my job is to look for patterns in large groups of data. And while I was running for office, I got to meet large groups of people.
Yeah.
And so it was like seeing my data in real time and asking, what is it that is driving this like wacky politics right now? And I'm realizing that because of all of the things we talked about already, that people can't find good work, that they're worried about affording their housing, that the food that they're eating is less nutritious, that the schools their kids go to are failing them, that there's this epidemic of insecurity about the future. And I think this epidemic both is a cause of our politics and also a consequence of our politics. And so I think we need to stop focusing on us versus them and start focusing on why do they do what they do. Okay. And what does it mean about how we should engage them? Right. And thinking about what it means to build a more representative government that really does involve all of us.
Yeah.
But at the same time, brings us together to have a conversation rather than tears us apart. And so, you know, I share some experiences from the campaign and from my life, but really trying to make this argument about what is causing this epidemic and what we need to do to treat it.
So, for young people like myself, people in college, people in high school, what can they do, or what do you have to inspire people to kind of look inward and ask those questions as to why these things are going on and what I can do to create that vision that you spoke about?
Maybe 3 things.
Okay.
Number 1, have conversations with people who you wouldn't usually have conversations with.
Okay.
Sit down, get to know them, right? People who don't look like you, who don't come from your background, who aren't even in your generation, right? Get to know them and get to know who they are and why. Mm-hmm. Those relationships really matter.
Yeah.
Number 2, when you're angry, ask why you're angry and why who you're angry at is angry too, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And then number 3, don't stop speaking up, right? We need people who can come to the debate and come with facts and come with perspectives and can stand in and say their truth. And often say their truth with a smile on their face, knowing that they're correct. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Oftentimes we turn into this, I'm just mad and you hurt me,
right,
rather than here's the truth of what's happening and here's what we have to do to solve it. Think about how you recruit that other person on the other side of that conversation to see the way the world like you see it, right? And recognize that it's not going to happen today. And the minute it evolves into anger, it's probably not going to happen at all.
Yeah.
There's a lot we have to do, and we can't cede our responsibility both to show up and to show up with the same humility, respect, and dignity that our Prophet ﷺ showed up with all the time.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Really appreciate you. Good luck in all your endeavors.
Thank you,
and
you too.
We'll post a link up to the book and to the podcast.
I appreciate that.
Great, thank you.